Tonight in Gaza, celebrations for a future without bombs after Hamas and Israel reach a ceasefire deal. 15 months of carnage and devastation coming to an end. And in Tel Aviv, Israeli hostage families are holding their breath in the real hope that their ordeal is also coming to an end. Good evening. If this is the destination, it took an extraordinary catalogue of suffering to get here. Almost 47,000 dead Palestinians, 1,200 Israelis killed on October the 7th in 2023, around 800 Israeli soldiers killed in Gaza fighting, a region in turmoil, and of course, almost 100 Israeli hostages still waiting to return home. A deal between Hamas and Israel had been on the cards before, so why has this one apparently worked? Just in time for Joe Biden to give his farewell address to America tonight. He's expected to speak shortly on the deal, setting the stage for President Trump, who's already taken credit for the deal on social media. Was it his pressure that forced the Israelis to sign that deal? And what now, especially in the rubble of Gaza? Tonight we have reaction from all sides.
And good evening from Leeds. Inflation is cut, are interest rates to follow? A relief for the Chancellor and plenty of others too.
The cost of products is continually rising, utility bills, gas, electric, they're all sky high. So we don't want to pass that price on to our customers.
And a warning from MPs that the crisis in providing for children with special educational needs in England risks creating a lost generation.
Beyond broken, it needs a full overhaul to look at every aspect. You know, it's failing families completely.
So, finally, Israel and Hamas have agreed to a deal to halt the war in Gaza and free the remaining hostages. It raises hopes for an end to the bloodiest round of fighting in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There are many questions. Why did it take so long? What changed? What now? How will Gaza be rebuilt and by whom? And what about the prospects of a Palestinian state at the end of all this? But first, what's actually in this deal, which begins on Sunday? The details were set out by Qatar's Prime Minister just a few minutes ago. Stage one will see a cessation of fighting between Israel and Hamas in Gaza and the release of 33 hostages held by Hamas, including women, children, the sick and men over 55, in exchange for the release of Palestinian security prisoners. The IDF will withdraw from populated areas, allow Palestinians to return to the north and let more aid trucks in. Negotiations for the subsequent stages will begin on day 16, aimed at getting the remaining hostages released and further Israeli withdrawals from the Strip. President Biden has also just welcomed the deal. Over now to our foreign affairs correspondent, Sikander Kamani, in Tel Aviv. Sikander.
Well, Matt, this war has taken such a terrible toll, and for so long it seemed as if there was no end in sight. Israel's assault in Gaza has been one of the most ferocious in modern history. Now, for tonight, for the first time in more than a year, the skies are quiet, no bombs are falling. Instead, there are scenes of celebrations on the streets here in Israel, where so many people are so desperate to see a return of the hostages that are still held by Hamas. There's a sense of hope, of anticipation, also of dread that perhaps somehow something could still go wrong. Qatar's Prime Minister, who's played a key role in mediating and negotiating this deal, just a few minutes ago announced that one had been reached, but said that steps on implementing it were still being worked on. There are still many challenges ahead. Tomorrow morning, the Israeli government will need to vote on this agreement, though we understand that's really something of a formality. Bigger questions remain about whether this will evolve into a longer-lasting ceasefire or whether negotiations will falter after this first 6-week phase and it will remain a more limited initial temporary pause that only sees some of the hostages released. Questions too for the longer term about who will run Gaza, about how the first Israeli hostages and Palestinian detainees, we understand, will be released from this Sunday. Everyone's waiting for this deal to start taking place.
Sikander, we'll get back to you later, but let's just listen to President Joe Biden speaking in Washington right now.
Vital supplies. You know, during the next 6 weeks, Israel will negotiate the necessary arrangements to get phase 2, which is a permanent end of the war. Let me say it again, a permanent end of the war. There are a number of details to negotiate to move from phase 1 to phase 2, but the plan says if negotiations take longer than 6 weeks, the ceasefire will continue as long as the negotiations continue. I've spoken to the Emir of Kuwait and the President of Egypt, and we have pledged to make sure the negotiations will keep moving forward for as long as it takes. Then, when phase 2 begins, there will be an exchange for release of the remaining living hostages, including male soldiers, and all remaining Israeli forces will be withdrawn from Gaza, and the temporary ceasefire will become permanent. And finally, phase 3, any final remains of hostages who have been killed will be returned to their families, and a major reconstruction plan for Gaza will begin. This is the ceasefire agreement I introduced last spring. Today, Hamas and Israel have agreed to that ceasefire agreement and the whole ending the war. You know, those of you who have followed the negotiations can attest, the road to this deal has not been easy. I've worked in foreign policy for decades. This is one of the toughest negotiations I've ever experienced. And we reached this point because of the pressure that Israel built on Hamas, backed by the United States. Hamas's longtime leader, Sinwar, was killed. Hamas's strongest supporter, Iran, launched attacks on Israel. And those attacks failed after my administration organized a coalition of nations to stop them. And after I ordered the U.S. ships and planes to come to Israel's defense, we also shaped Israel's strong and calibrated response, destroying Iran's air defenses, but avoiding an escalatory cycle of an all-out war. The United States also organized a coalition of 20 countries to stand up to attacks by the Houthis, including their missile attacks in Israel. Then, Hezbollah.
Well, there we go. President Biden speaking right now in the White House. He said it's been a tough road to get to this deal. He said the deal had been on the table 6 months ago. Just imagine the tens of thousands of people who've been injured and killed as a result of this delay. Well, we now have that deal. We're obviously waiting for a response from the Israeli government, and we'll get response later in the program from the Palestinians. And I should just point out that President Trump, the man who will take over from Biden in a few days' time, he took credit for actually getting this deal through. Well, we'll discuss that as well. But let's go back to Sikander in Tel Aviv and his report. Sorry, so we heard from Sikander. We're now going to hear from his report. Here's his report.
After more than a year of unimaginable pain, celebrations on Gaza's streets as news of the ceasefire filtered through tonight. Young lives overshadowed by this war. Now, finally, a chance of a more peaceful future.
والله احنا فرحانين كثير انه الهم والحزن والقصف والموت اللي صار فينا انه خلص بطل صار وقف وانه حنرجع بلادنا وحنرجع لاهلنا.
Earlier today, heart-wrenching final embraces, even in what could prove to be the final hours of Israel's deadly war in Gaza. These, the victims of a strike in Deir al-Balah that killed 11 people, including 4 children from one family. Any ceasefire too late for them and more than 46,000 others here.
يعني احنا من اسبوعين واحنا بنتبع الاخبار انه تهدئه ومش تهدئه والكلام اللي بنسمعه. اللي على ارض الواقع يا جماعه غير تماما. اللي على ارض الواقع كل يوم مزيد من القتل، مزيد من التدمير، مربعات سكنيه باكملها بتمحى، احياء باكملها بتمحى.
Peace in Gaza would mean peace in a wasteland. 2/3 of all buildings in the territory destroyed or damaged by Israeli strikes. With practically the entire population displaced and hunger widespread, everyone has been hoping for an end to the fighting.
الناس في انتظار كل لحظة إنه الهدنة تبدأ، لأنه للأمانة إحنا مش عايشين، إحنا عايشين بحكم الموتى، هذه مش حياة. كل دقيقة بتمر علينا كأنها سنة، الناس بتموت كل لحظة.
In Israel's hostage square, focal point for the families of the more than 90 Israeli hostages still held captive by Hamas. Tonight, there was cautious optimism.
We are just waiting for them to come home. We're excited, obviously, but until they're not here, we don't want to get too excited.
There's also still fear. On multiple occasions, a deal has seemed imminent, only to fall through. 33 hostages would be released in a first 6-week phase in exchange for hundreds of Palestinian detainees. Will the two sides be able to agree on continuing the deal beyond that?
We know that there can be many accidents on the way and many issues that can postpone it or delay it, so we are not there yet.
Amidst the misery and squalor that has become Gaza, families dream of their old lives. Amal, suffering from cancer, forced to flee Gaza City, is already imagining what it would be like to return to whatever is left of her home.
أنا يمكن لما يفتحوا الحاجز يقولوا يلا ارجعوا يمكن مع الفرحة ما بعرف يمكن أمشي حافية من كتر الفرحة يمكن آخذ حفيد من أحفادي يعني يمكن محمد قديش صغير بالعمر عمره أيام يمكن هيك أحضنه وأركض فيه أمسك أحفادي يعني أولادي هيك ماشيين وراي هالعالم كلها تركض يعني راجعة أحس خطواتي إنها عم تركض أنا كأني راكبة طيارة وصولي لغزة.
Two peoples divided by so much, united for now in cautious hope. Well, the outlines of this deal are really pretty much the same as the outlines of the deal that we've been talking about for much of the past year after it was outlined by President Biden last May. Since then, thousands more Palestinians as well as multiple Israeli hostages have been killed. It's hard to escape the conclusion that a key driving factor behind the success of the talks at this stage now is the upcoming inauguration of President Trump. He had threatened that all hell would be unleashed if the hostages are not released. But perhaps it's his impact on the Israeli government that is more significant. Netanyahu, it seems, likely thought that whilst Biden was in power, that perhaps Trump would be more supportive of his war effort. But Trump making clear that he wanted an end to the war before he took office. We'll have to wait and see if that's what this ceasefire agreement evolves into. We'll also have to wait and see what kind of offers may have been made to the Israeli right in terms of their plans for the occupied West Bank in order to get them on board with this agreement.
All good, Christian. Sikandar, thank you very much indeed there in Tel Aviv. Well, joining me now is Sharon Lifshitz, whose elderly father is still being held hostage in Gaza. Her mother was freed after 2 weeks in captivity. Welcome to the studio, Sharon.
Thank you for
How do you feel?
Cautious, almost speechless, almost I haven't prepared for a yes. We have gone through so long.
Because you've been here before as well, haven't you? With deals that you thought were going to happen and they didn't happen.
Exactly.
It seems that this one is going to happen.
It has been agreed. It hasn't been agreed since the last deal that fell through. And that is the most important thing, that, you know, we need to make sure that it happens, that the first stage lead to the second stage and that it doesn't collapse halfway.
And we can see some pictures now, I think, of your mother and father. Your mother, as we said earlier, was released after 2 weeks. I'll ask you about her in a minute, but your father is still in Gaza. Do you actually know, and this is a difficult question, but do you know whether he's alive?
No, we don't know. We do not know. We do not know. We know he was 84. He is 84. He wasn't in great health. It would take a bit of a miracle for him to survive in these conditions. But we didn't believe my mom will come back alive either. We have to hold on to the hope. And I have to prepare myself to at least knowing.
Must be so difficult to be here tonight on what could be a night of celebration or just a night of knowing.
I think above all, there are 98 hostages out of them. We know we have a lot of funerals coming, but we also know that some of them will be reunited with their families, and there's nothing more we can ask for at this point. I think it's time for a ceasefire. It's time to withdraw from Gaza. It's time to alleviating the suffering on both sides and in Gaza too.
Should this day that we're experiencing now have happened a long time before?
Absolutely. It could have happened. Ben-Gvir just came out and
the security minister.
Yeah, and said that he delayed the deal and did everything he can to stop the deal. I think
so this is about Israeli politics, delaying the return of your father and others.
That's what he claimed. That's what that minister claimed. I don't think Hamas have done everything they could in order to save their own people. Unfortunately, they've been really harsh to their own people. And I think above all, we have to at the moment concentrate on the fact that a deal is signed, to thank the outgoing administration and the incoming administration in the States for working together, for not waiting until Trump gets into office, but putting it as a deadline. Deadline has seemed to have worked, have brought about a ceasefire, not a ceasefire yet, but it's coming, and a deal. May it be the start of a better place for all the people of the region.
Let me ask you about your mother. She was held in captivity for 2 weeks. And I'm not sure if we have pictures of her being released back in November. How is she doing? I mean, how was it like for her to adjust to normality, in inverted commas, without her husband?
It's really tough. She says sometimes she just starts speaking to him. She lost her home, everything that she ever owned. She lost so many good friends. She lives not where she lived for the last 65 years. She's also really full of life and really believe in the living. I think she finds it's really hard, but at the same time, so much has happened. She holds on to life.
Briefly and finally, a difficult question as well. Do you think you can live side by side with the Palestinians after this?
Yes. I mean, there's 7 million Jews and 7 million Palestinians living in that region. We need to find a way.
You have to live with each other. That's the neighborhood.
We need to find a way. I think this is terrible. I think if anything we should do now is make sure, this is the worst of it.
I wish you all the best, and your father, of course. Sharon Lifshitz, thank you very much for coming in. Good luck.
Thank you.
Well, we're joined now by Miri Aysin, who's a retired colonel from the Israeli Defense Forces and is now at the International Institute for Counterterrorism. Thanks for coming back on the program. What do you think was the decisive factor that led to Bibi Netanyahu agreeing this deal? Was it Donald Trump, basically reading him the riot act?
I'm going to answer you, but for a moment, I am also breathless after your talk now with Sharon Lifshitz. She makes me feel stronger, and I'm saying that sitting in Tel Aviv, and she's sitting next to you, and I just want to say, wow, okay? That's the resilience of Israeli people. I absolutely think that the Trump administration, the change of administration, meaning the fact that not Kamala Harris, but Donald Trump, and that change from the Democratic administration to the Republican administration makes a big change. It makes a change for all of the region, not just for Israel. And I think that that is part of it. But if I can gently push back at your question, why is everybody saying all of the time that this is about Israel? Because Hamas was on board, because Hamas agreed to everything, because we believe that Hamas in May was not the problem. I gently push back at that because I think we forget who Hamas is.
Well, I was going to put that question to my Palestinian guest after this interview, but there you go. You raised the question yourself. But whether it's I'm talking to you or I'm talking to a Palestinian official, the fact that this deal was delayed by 6 months. And it could have been signed. And in those 6 months, thousands of more people had to die. And the agony of families like the Lifshitzes had to continue. And the rubble had to, get worse. That surely must fill you with horror.
It fills me with horror because war is horror. It also fills me with horror, and I say this openly to everybody. It fills me with horror, the idea that today Yahya Sinwar is revered around the world. That people wear T-shirts with Yahya Sinwar.
But is he really revered around the world? I don't
Liberated.
see people wearing his T-shirts on the streets of London, Berlin, or Paris, or Washington, or
I'll show them to you. You may not have seen them, but I checked them out.
But are they
They're on US
representative of a
campuses,
wider
they're in the-
opinion?
But the thing is that in that sense, as I look at it, first of all, I don't absolve the government that I live inside of from any blame whatsoever. We were in a very challenging situation before the war started. It stepped into the war, and the issues, not just of the hostages, but of the running of this war, became something political. And I say that because it's absolutely on the table. I do not think that the war could have ended in May, but that's my opinion. But I think that because of Hamas, not because of the Israeli government. Having said that, I definitely think that the Israeli government could have done more before. I wish we would have done more before, even if I think that Hamas at the time would not have fulfilled any of the things that it said it would.
And do you think that after all this horror of the last year and a few months, it is possible, or should be possible, that something good will come out of it that will last? And I'm talking here about the thing that Mr. Biden wants, and Mr. Trump may even want, a two-state solution.
Can I make the worst comparison and say that after World War II, which was a just war and an important war, at the end of the war, the world changed. And that's the only very positive aspect of every war, including this horrific war.
Yes, but how will it
people,
change?
It changes the situation.
But
at the end, as Sharon said before, between the river and the sea, as we like to call it, are 15 million people. We're not going away. We're not going away. The Palestinians, it's not Jews, Muslims, Arabs, Christians. There's so many ways to define them. We're all here, and we're going to have to find a way to live here together. And that doesn't make a happily ever after,
right,
by the
but
way.
do the Palestinians, after all this, deserve, and very briefly, deserve the dignity of their own self-determination, their own state?
They deserved it before, they deserve it after. Can we distinguish between the Palestinians, and I have supported the two-state solution my entire life, and Hamas, the murderous organization that planned for over 2 years the most murderous attack you can imagine?
Mary Eisen, thank you very much indeed. Well, Donald Trump, still not quite president, was quick to claim credit for the deal, although the Biden administration had been racing to get it agreed before he leaves office in just 5 days' time. So let's get the latest from our Washington correspondent, Siobhan Kennedy. Siobhan.
Well, Matt, we just saw President Biden speak in the White House. He was flanked very ceremoniously, I have to say, with his Vice President Kamala Harris beside him and his Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken. We know that this is a moment that he very, very much wanted to reach, to take a victory lap on Gaza before he heads out of the office in just 5 days' time and hands over the reins to Donald Trump. Let's hear what the president had to say now, a little clip from him.
I can announce a ceasefire and a hostage deal has been reached between Israel and Hamas. For more than 15 months of conflict that began with Hezbollah's brutal massacre on October the 7th, more than 15 months of terror for the hostages, their families, the Israeli people, more than 15 months of suffering by the innocent people of Gaza.
Well, Joe Biden is very keen to stress that this is the exact framework of the deal that he outlined several months ago back in the summer, and that this wouldn't have been achieved unless he had been pushing forward constantly with his and his team's diplomacy. But he did also stress that over the last few days he has worked, he said, as one team with the incoming President Donald Trump's team also on the ground in Tel Aviv. And he said that he is aware, of course, that the next stage of the deal, the next critical 6 weeks, will be implemented, in fact, by Donald Trump's team. But he said he believes that there is a genuine opportunity here, he thinks, for a new future. Donald Trump, you will not be surprised to hear, is also out there on his Truth social network claiming credit for the deal, calling what he said to his supporters calling this an epic ceasefire agreement, which he said could only have happened because of his historic victory in November and his stated intention to the world, he said, that he would immediately bring about peace. Let's hear a little thing from him now. Let's see that. He said on that Truth Social post, "We've achieved so much without even being in the White House. Just imagine all of the wonderful things that will happen when I return to the White House and my administration is fully confirmed so they can secure more victories for the United States." Crucial, of course, is what happens over the next 6 weeks. Joe Biden is hoping that ceasefire will turn into a permanent ceasefire. But as we have seen throughout this brutal war, it ain't over until it's over. And that now is in the hands of Donald Trump and his team.
Indeed. Siobhan Kennedy, thanks very much. Well, Hassam Zumlot is the head of the Palestinian mission to the UK. He joins me now. Good to see you again, Ambassador Zumlot. Does it matter to you as a Palestinian whether this was Donald Trump, applying pressure to the Israelis, or Joe Biden finally being listened to?
No, it doesn't. What matters is the carnage to stop. 15 months of utter loss, grief, sheer human suffering. And finally, we have good news. We can breathe now, a sigh of relief, and look ahead.
You're confident that this will stick?
Look ahead. I'm very cautious, like all of us. Those who know Netanyahu and the Israeli composition, those who know the dynamics in Israel, will be extremely cautious. But we have got to be hopeful and press ahead. We have got to end this mass murder and learn the lessons of the last 15 months.
Okay, we'll get to those lessons in a minute. But, Donald Trump said a few days ago that unless those hostages were released and a deal was done, all hell would be unleashed. And we always thought at the time he was talking about Hamas, but actually he was probably talking about the Israelis. At the same time, it has also taken Hamas 6 months to sign up to this deal.
No, you've heard,
both sides have delayed, right?
You've heard President Biden clearly saying this was presented in May by him, and it was. And it was adopted by the Security Council, and it was. And it is very well documented that it was Netanyahu who rejected it. So why are we discussing
Well, okay. But the tragedy is that in the interim, so many more people had to die.
Yeah, that's not only a tragedy. That is something that we need to absolutely make sure, A, justice is served, and B, it never, ever happens again. So yes, it's such a tragedy that we should have reached this long, long ago, actually by November 2023. And the world need to learn the lesson of its own failure. This is the first time that the international community fails to stop, let alone prevent, a genocide in real time. And I believe the impact on our international order is going to be severe. So this is a moment when we hold ourselves together and rebuild all that has been destroyed. And that is not just Gaza. It's also the buildings and the relevance of buildings in New York and our global system.
The Israelis, of course, would reject the charge of genocide, and they would say that this latest horrific round of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict would not have happened if it hadn't been for Hamas's attack on October the 7th.
Well, ICJ has said that the crime of genocide is plausible already in January last year. But I assure you, Matt, once this stops, once you and I have the ability to go to Gaza and see the criminal genocidal aggression on our people in Gaza, you and I will dread that moment.
Well, we have all been asking to go back there, to report from there. We have been denied access.
Who prevented you, Matt?
Well,
who prevented you?
The Israelis prevented us.
The Israelis prevented you.
Right, and we know that, and we've been talking to them about that. What happens now? Let's say the ceasefire sticks. What happens after the end of the second phase?
Number one,
how do you see the future of Gaza?
Number one, we need to make sure that this ceasefire holds. Netanyahu is maneuvering all the time, changing his goalposts and calculations and coalitions. Number two, we need to make sure it's permanent, that Israel leaves all of Gaza, that the people of Gaza are able to go back to their homes without any hindrance, that unprecedented international humanitarian assistance is delivered. Our babies is dying because of freezing and hunger and what have you. This is unmatched in human history.
Who runs Gaza?
It is the state of Palestine. What do you mean? Nobody should ask that question.
Why?
Never again, because the Palestinian people have the state of Palestine that represents all of them, that has a seat in the United Nations. Their fight, their struggle for 100 years is for that state of Palestine. The state of Palestine has its national institutions.
But
The
which
PLO
Palestinians will end up running Gaza?
There is no which Palestinians. Fatah, Hamas are political factions. I am talking. You
fight each other. You have done in the past.
Now you're discussing with me Labour and Conservatives. You're not discussing with me the UK as a state and a government. We have a government that is recognized by the world. That government, the people in Gaza are demanding, longing for the PLO and the government to come back and take its responsibility. And let me say it now and very clearly, there will be no alternative but the Palestinian national institutions, the PLO and its institutions to take over. We will not leave Gaza in a vacuum. It is our responsibility and we will fulfill it.
And we will speak to you again about what it actually looks like, but we've run out of time. Hassan Zomlo, thank you very much indeed. Well, a few minutes ago, Sir Keir Starmer gave his response to the deal. Let's get the latest reaction from Westminster and our senior political correspondent, Paul McNamara. Paul.
Yeah, it's a very delicately written statement recognising the suffering of both the Israeli hostages and the people of Gaza. The Prime Minister says after months of devastating bloodshed and countless lives lost, this is the long overdue news that the Israeli and Palestinian people have desperately been waiting for. They have borne the brunt of this conflict triggered by the brutal terrorists of Hamas. The hostages, who were brutally ripped from their homes on that day and held captive in unimaginable conditions ever since, can fondly return to their families. But we should also use this moment to pay tribute to those who won't make it home. For the innocent Palestinians whose homes turned into a war zone overnight and the many who lost their lives, the ceasefire must allow a huge surge in humanitarian aid. And then he turns to the future. This war has been a huge issue for Keir Starmer over the last 18 months. It's very close to his heart whenever you speak to him, not just because of the only British Israeli hostage who's still being held, Emily Damari. Keir Starmer has met her mother. He's always maintained that a ceasefire that would be dependent on the hostages being released. Domestically, it's also been an issue for Keir Starmer. The war is seen as the reason why Labour lost a few seats during the election. But texting with government officials tonight, texting with people surrounded by Keir Starmer, the point they make is that those domestic issues pale into insignificance when it comes to the importance of ending this war.
Paul in Westminster, thank you very much indeed. Well, more on the Gaza agreement later in the programme, and let's go to Kathy in Leeds. Kathy.
Thanks, Matt. Now, after days of turmoil on the markets, some good news for the Chancellor after an unexpected fall in December's inflation figures to 2.5%. That could allow the Bank of England to cut interest rates next month, as well as easing the pressure on Rachel Reeves herself. Our economics reporter Neil MacDonald has all the details.
Finally, some relief for an embattled Chancellor. Inflation for December was forecast to stick at 2.6%. Instead, it's dropped just to 2.5%. The smallest change possible, but it was enough to send interest rates on government debt plummeting. Rachel Reeves' budget calculations were under threat. Debt markets across the world suspecting that neither inflation nor interest rates were falling as fast as expected. The Chancellor selling government policies over breakfast with business leaders today. The lower inflation number eases the pressure on her, at least for now.
Well, it's good that inflation is coming down to target, but we know the cost of living is still a pressure for many families across the country, and there's more work to do. When the Chancellor in this government talks about bringing stability back to the economy and our politics, this was an important part of that, and it shows that the Prime Minister's plan for change is working.
Airfares in December were lower than expected, and that played a big part in cutting inflation. That statistical blip helped the government today, but it may not be repeated.
I was like, should we go together?
Yeah.
And many businesses see higher costs and higher prices on the horizon. Rochelle Anthony has been cutting hair for 13 years. She says the Chancellor's decision to raise national insurance on her staff is just another cost, slowing her business down.
I'm still going, but I'm holding on, literally holding on with my claws in, trying to keep going. The cost of products is continually rising, utility bills, gas, electric, they're all sky high. So we don't want to pass that price on to our customers. It's so hard to actually source things now that are what they were costing 6 months ago, everywhere is charging the same prices, and they're all really, really high, sky high.
The cost of living crisis, which saw inflation peak at over 11%, now seems firmly in the past. But in recent months, price rises have been edging up again, and despite today's fall, some economists see inflation rising above 3% by April. If that does happen, the Conservatives are keen to pin it on the Chancellor's tax increases.
Mr. Speaker, just today, the British Retail Consortium says 2/3 of businesses will have to raise prices to cope with his tax hike. His Chancellor ignored all the warnings and ploughed ahead with an unprecedented borrowing spree, leaving all of us more vulnerable.
Mr. Speaker, we took the right and difficult decisions at the budget. Decisions that they did not have the courage to take, which left us in the mess in the first place.
Today's fall in inflation makes it more likely the Bank of England will lower interest rates next month. That could give the economy a short-term boost. But for many businesses, it's higher taxes, which they say are now cutting their prospects for growth.
Well, earlier I spoke to the Trade Policy Minister, Douglas Alexander, who's announced a multi-billion-pound investment deal with Malaysia today. But first, I asked for his reaction to reports of a ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas.
Well, as I arrived in the studio, the details were still emerging. But if, as is reported, a deal has been secured, then it is both welcome and overdue. The British government has been consistently arguing, along with international partners, that we need to see the hostages released, we need to see aid getting into Gaza, and of course we need to see the killing stop. So in that sense, if the reports prove to be vindicated in the coming hours, it will be an overdue relief and a matter of welcome for the British government.
Of course, you're announcing your own economic deal, your own investment deal with the Malaysians. Is this the kind of thing that Rachel Reeves wants to do to sort of turbocharge the economy?
Well, I think arguably we're going to have the most politically stable of the G7 economies in recent years. I think that explains why we were in a position to secure about £63 billion worth of headline investments at the time of the International Investment Summit in the late autumn. And this announcement from the Malaysians is a reflection of, I think, a degree of confidence amongst internationally mobile investors that the United Kingdom is a good place in which to be doing business in the coming years.
Well, this deal you're announcing today, you say will deliver schools and homes, but you're spending more on debt interest than on schools and hospitals. This is a major headache for the Chancellor, isn't it?
Well, listen, we are ever vigilant as to movements in the international bond markets. You wouldn't expect me to offer a running commentary on that. I'm a trade minister, not the Treasury minister. But the reality is we've set out our fiscal rules. We've taken, frankly, difficult fiscal decisions in order to ensure that we filled the black hole that we inherited. And on that basis, as I say, we'll then be taking decisions in relation to the National Wealth Fund, the establishment of GB Energy, trade policy, industrial policy, planning policy, the whole range of levers that you would expect over the coming 4.5 years to deliver the growth that everyone wants to see.
But the chair of the CBI, the Business Lobby Group, says that in trying to fill one black hole, the one you inherited, as you point out, you've created another one.
Well, I simply don't agree. The fact is, when you have a problem, you have a responsibility to deal with it. That was a responsibility the previous government weren't willing to discharge. It's right to recognise we could have raised about £20 billion in that budget simply to fill the £22 billion black hole that we inherited. But we were clear that we received a mandate from the British people in July, not just to stabilise the public finances, but also to take action to address the crisis in our public services. People want to see investment in the National Health Service. That's why we've committed not just to investment, but also to reform in the health service at the beginning of the Parliament, so that we see the benefits accruing to the British people in the course of the next 4.5 years. So you're right, it was a judgment at the time of the budget. I think it was a judgment consistent with the expectations of the British people.
And now all the talk around the corridors of Whitehall is about public spending cuts. You know, you came to power promising to change Britain. You've got the NHS advertising for nurses to treat people in corridors. Schools are bracing for cuts. When are we going to see this change?
Well, the truth is I've just left the corridors of power in Whitehall. So with respect, that wasn't the conversations that we were having. It was about a trade strategy and industrial strategy and indeed the kind of initiatives that we've been describing. We've said that we will
should you raise taxes before cutting spending then?
Well, frankly, we never discuss future fiscal events. There's going to be a statement from the Chancellor in March, at which point we will receive the OBR forecast. I can't speculate as to what those independent forecasts will say in the middle of March, but I am clear as what the Prime Minister and indeed the Chancellor said in recent days, that the markets and the public can feel a degree of assurance that we will take whatever action is necessary to keep ourselves aligned with the rules that we've set out.
OK. Just finally, how concerned are you about the prospect of Donald Trump slapping a load of tariffs on us and then, further weakening growth potentially?
Well, let's see. In chancelleries and in prime ministerial offices around the world, everyone is trying to figure out, if you like, is what President Trump says matched by what President Trump does. The reality is, of course, he's spoken a great deal as a candidate. He talked about tariff being the favourite word in the dictionary as far as he was concerned. Let's wait and see exactly what emerges after the inauguration on Monday. But you can be assured that there's been a great deal of thought and contingency planning being put towards exactly those challenges by a responsible British government.
Douglas Alexander, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Well, I've also been speaking to the economics professor who inspired Keir Starmer's growth missions, Mariana Mazzucato from University College London, and Rain Newton-Smith, chief executive of the CBI. I began by asking Rain if she thought Rachel Reeves had turned a corner with the economy.
Well, I think lower inflation today is certainly welcome news, and hopefully that will lead to a lower path for interest rates. So I'm sure Rachel Reeves will be breathing a sigh of relief, but the work is not done there. We just absolutely have to make it easier for businesses in the UK to invest and to grow their businesses.
Well, Mariana Mazzucato, that's the point, isn't it? Because businesses, according to the Tory leader, are laying people off because of the budget. Labour's just made it worse.
Well, I don't know about that. First of all, these recent changes in interest rates and inflation just show that we need to be careful to distinguish long-run structural features in the economy from the daily noise that goes up and down. And what we really should be worried about are those structural features. So for the last 20 years, the UK has had very low public investment. We are one of the lowest in the G7. Had we invested the average, we would have invested 500 billion more over the last 20 years, and especially business investment has been low. We can't have, companies like Thames Water just giving all the money out as dividend payouts and, to the shareholders. We need profits to be reinvested back in.
Rain, what do you make of that?
I think we're all agreed we have to make it easier for businesses to invest in this country. From the business leaders I speak to, they don't want to be walked from government department to department. They want to have a responsive government that gives them the planning permission to deliver the investment that will create jobs and growth and the productivity that Mariana is talking about.
Mariana, what would emergency public spending cuts do to your vision of this growth future?
Well, first of all, these fiscal rules that Rain rightly talks about, what that is doing is allowing the government that kind of headroom, especially for the capital investment in the economy. So that's infrastructure, it's all those things that drive innovation. But of course, we also need public spending in the day-to-day because we have, frankly, a crumbling welfare state. Our NHS is on its knees. So I'm someone who tries not to distinguish so much the kind of spending that's required in health in order to make our population resilient, healthy, and have well-being, but also that kind of innovation side of the infrastructure, of the AI strategy, of the life sciences strategy. We need both.
Well, Rain, your response to that, and particularly the idea that, these crumbling public services can't be starved of any more resources?
We know that the answer to that is higher growth, which delivers higher tax receipts, which helps to fund our public services. And whether it's thinking about the health of our nation, there's a huge role for business to play in that. But ultimately, it has to come from investment, and that investment needs to come from the private sector. And what we need to ensure is that the decisions that the government don't make it harder for businesses to invest in their people, to invest in innovation, and to create jobs.
So when Keir Starmer leaves the door open for further tax rises, that would be a disincentive to investment, would businesses think?
What I'm hearing from the business leaders that I speak to is if we look back to the budget in the autumn, that made it much more difficult for businesses to invest. It reduced their headroom for investment in the near term. And so they can't shoulder anymore. I was speaking to one business leader who said the decisions taken have increased their overall bills by 25 million, and they are looking at how do they address that increase in costs when they don't have the ability to pass that on to their customers.
Mariana, do you agree that the government shouldn't be going back to raise taxes on business? Do you agree with what Rain was saying there?
So, first of all, we should distinguish types of businesses, and I think what we just heard is absolutely right in terms of making sure that how we design the tax system is not penalizing small businesses that often already are struggling. There's many large businesses and many global large businesses that actually pay very little tax. Instead of just talking about tax, there's corporate tax, there's capital gains tax, there's income tax. What we need is that kind of portfolio of taxes that the government has choices over what to do with, to make sure that they are being designed in a smart way.
Rain, you were looking to get in.
Look, I think what I would also say is we've got to remember that large businesses in the everyday economy are the ones who are creating jobs. There are some really important companies who are really working hard to create investment and jobs in the UK. And I think we just need to keep them front and centre of the growth mission.
Mariana, finally and briefly, you inspired Sir Keir Starmer's missions. Are you disappointed with how it's all panned out?
No, I'm not disappointed, but I do think that we really need to take those missions seriously, and definitely in a more sustainable way of producing, and that's both food, energy, materials, transport.
Rain, is business as disappointed as some of your members suggest in what Labour's done, particularly since the budget?
Look, all the business leaders that I speak to absolutely want this government to succeed. This is not about a race to the bottom, it's about a race to the top. But we cannot make it harder for businesses in that everyday economy to take a chance on creating more jobs and investing in our local communities.
Rain Newton-Smith, Mariana Mazzucato, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, now, an ongoing crisis in the provision of support for children with special educational needs in England risks creating a lost generation, according to a new report from the Public Accounts Committee. Meeting the cost of rising demand is currently threatening to bankrupt almost half of the councils providing it, yet the outcomes for children are too often poor. Children are supposed to get an Education, Health and Care, or EHC, plan within 20 weeks. But today's report highlights a postcode lottery in the provision of support. In Leeds, less than 1 in 10 children got a plan in that time frame, whereas in neighbouring Wakefield, almost 9 in 10 children got their plan within 20 weeks. Andrew Misra has been finding out more.
5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Getting Seth proper support can feel like a game of chance for his mum, Jenny. Seth has ADHD and autism. There is a plan in place for his care. The 10-year-old hasn't been to school for months, though, as Jenny doesn't think a mainstream school is the right environment for him.
It's just been a constant battle, facing barrier after barrier, and with minimal support. We've found the best support that we can find would always be from charities rather than statutory services, which is really unfair.
Would you say the system's broken?
Beyond broken, it needs a full overhaul to look at every aspect. It's failing families completely. It's failing Seth. Our home life is pretty much non-existent because I'm at the computer all the time trying to look at bits and pieces that I can try and evidence that Seth needs more support than he's getting.
The local council in Wakefield says it's trying to work with Jenny and Seth to better understand his needs and how these can be supported. They live in one of the better performing areas for special educational needs provision. The wider system has been condemned in a report by Parliament's spending watchdog, calling it chaotic, unviable and an emergency that's been allowed to run and run.
Since 2015, schools have seen an extra 1 million pupils receive SEN support. In that time, there's been a 140% increase in the number of children with an education, health and care plan. Trying to keep up with that demand has left councils across England facing an estimated £4.6 billion black hole. And now, almost half of local authorities are at risk of going bankrupt by next year.
What do I mean by mingle then, do you think? Mixed up, yeah.
Day to day, there's dedicated support for children with SEN at this mainstream secondary school in Sheffield. This doesn't happen everywhere, though.
I've worked in a number of different local authorities and sadly it can be quite different in terms of the processes that we go through and it can often be a time issue in terms of getting the right support and needs for families, and that comes with a lot of stress and anxiety.
Is SEN provision like a postcode lottery?
I think there's inconsistencies, most definitely. I think it's about understanding the system. I was at a SEND conference not long ago and they kept talking about the need to fix the plane whilst it's in flight.
Last month, the government announced £740 million to create more specialist places in mainstream schools. The Education Secretary insists she understands the scale of the problem she's inherited.
We have let down so many children and families in our country, the families who have lost confidence in the system, the children who are not getting the outcomes that they deserve. So nothing's off the table in terms of what we consider around what reform will look like.
Today's report calls for urgent action. Children like Seth cannot afford to wait.
And after the break, the latest on the Gaza hostage and ceasefire deal. We'll be getting that is from our correspondent in Tel Aviv. Live pictures there. Stay with us. Welcome back, and a reminder of tonight's main news. Israel and Hamas have agreed a ceasefire and hostage release deal. The first phase will begin on Sunday, ending 15 months of war. President Biden said the road to the deal had not been easy, describing it as one of the toughest negotiations that I've ever experienced. Well, let's get the latest now from Sikander Kamani in Tel Aviv. Sikander, the president of Israel, Yitzhak Herzog, has just been speaking. What did he have to say?
Yeah, President Herzog has been talking and he said that, well, he called on the Israeli government and security cabinet tomorrow morning to vote in favour of this agreement. It does seem as if it's going to be a formality, but up until now, far-right members of the ruling coalition, Ben Gvir, Bezalel Smotrich, had threatened to leave the government over their opposition to the deal. It seems now perhaps they may oppose it, but will not bring down the government. We'll have to wait and see exactly what does transpire, though.
And what else can you tell us about the details of the agreement?
Yeah, more details emerging now. Of course, we know that the first stage is going to be 42 days in which 33 Israeli hostages will be released in exchange for hundreds of Palestinian prisoners, as well as this ceasefire. Just over 2 weeks after that comes into place, negotiations are going to start to begin on the second phase of the deal. That would see a longer-lasting ceasefire and the release of other remaining hostages. And that's crucial because up until now, Prime Minister Netanyahu had always talked about wanting to resume the war against Hamas in Gaza until, in his words, they were all eliminated. And we've seen, in fact, in some images from the streets of Gaza tonight, amidst the celebrations, pictures of armed Hamas fighters. So clearly, although they've sustained a lot of blows, the group very much still does exist. On the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza, also more details coming through on how that's going to be treated, with up to 600 aid trucks crossing into Gaza every day. And that's crucial with starvation and hunger widespread. Also crucially, the Rafah border crossing with Egypt is going to be reopened once all Israeli female hostages have been released. And that's particularly crucial for the 12,000 or so Palestinians who are in urgent need of medical care because they're wounded or because they're desperately sick and who need to be evacuated. What's interesting here in Israel is that just how quiet it is. And that's, I think, because people here are cautious about whether or not the full terms of this agreement will end up taking place.
Sikander, thank you very much indeed. Well, it is certainly a significant day. Whether it turns out to be historic depends very much on the details. Thanks to all of you for watching. We're back at 7 o'clock tomorrow night. Until then, that is Channel 4 News. Have a good evening.
Today's outlook may take a turn. Channel 4 weather, sponsored by DeLonghi Bean to Cup coffee machines.
Good evening. Our weather's looking pretty settled over the next couple of days, but for much of the time there'll be a fair amount of cloud quite widely, and it will start to turn chilly again, particularly across the south. Now today, many northern and western areas have been fine with some sunshine, but you can see clouds lingered for much of the day across East Anglia and southeast England, and that cloud will stick tonight, so still the odd spot of light rain or drizzle. For the rest of England, along with Wales, clear skies, but some fog for southwest England, southeast Wales, the Midlands toward Yorkshire. Then for Scotland and Northern Ireland, cloud will come and go, but most places will be dry. Frosty in the central zone under the clearer skies, down to freezing or just below. Elsewhere, typically holding up at 3 to 9 degrees. So tomorrow, across England and Wales, mist and fog will gradually disperse, but many southern and eastern areas having a fairly cloudy day, the best of the sunshine towards the north and west. And for Scotland and Northern Ireland, cloud will come and go, but most places will have a reasonably dry day. Here's the picture then in a bit more detail, 4 in the afternoon, and bright skies at this point of the day for the Channel Islands, but you can see that sheet of cloud is still there lingering across southern and eastern parts of England and Wales, but head northwards, we're back into brighter skies and a bit more in the way of sunshine for many. Temperatures not quite as high, but roughly where they should be, typically in the range of 7 to 9 degrees for most. Now, by the time we get to Friday, for most of us, it'll be a cloudy and grey start to the day, and only skies slightly brightening across England and Wales. Overall, a fair amount of cloud. For Scotland and Northern Ireland, a blustery wind, a little bit of rain moving through from time to time. Mild in the north, double figures there, but chilly, just 5 or 6 Celsius further southwards. Enjoy your evening. Goodbye.
It's starting to pour. DeLonghi Bean to Cup coffee machines sponsor Weather on 4.